In this lecture, I'm going to talk about biology, botany, and zoology. Biology is actually a bit of an anachronism when applied to antiquity. There isn't really an ancient science of biology per se. As too with modern medicine and science, the boundaries between biology and medical science are also not completely meaningful, in fact even less so in antiquity. So in this lecture I'll be including some more of the theoretical foundations of the study of living beings, including human beings, particularly Aristotle's conception of biological substances. I'll also talk a little about anatomy, which is sometimes thought of as medicine, and indeed I will return to it in more detail in the next lecture, which is about medicine. Today I'll also talk a bit about embryology and reproduction, which are usually included in life sciences rather than medicine per se. Biology as such was not a major focus of the pre-Socratic philosophers. In the next lecture, we'll come back to medicine, where there was quite a lot of pre-Socratic work. Most pre-Socratic physiology and anatomy that was done was really in the service of human anatomy for medical reasons, and that's sort of obvious when you think about why that might be the case. And I will talk about that quite a bit more in the next lecture. That said, we do have a few bits of evidence of the more underlying biological and zoological theory among pre-Socratic writers. Some of the earliest writers discuss the origins of life. You'll remember the Milesians from previous lectures, and Anaximander was one of those who discussed the origins of life. He suggested that animals have their origins in moisture, and interestingly, that humans may have developed from some sort of fish creatures. Obviously, that is exciting to us when we think about the history of evolution, and of course, we must be very careful about how we apply that, but certainly interesting. Another substance monist, and you'll probably remember that from the lecture on cosmology. So another substance monist when it comes to biological theory was Diogenes of Apollonia in the 5th century. This is a different Diogenes to the more famous Diogenes the Cynic, who was the one who lived in a barrel and was rude to people. So this Diogenes of Apollonia is an older Diogenes, also from Miletus. So we have some fragments preserved in Simplicius and Aristotle of his views. He made the case that differences in animal kinds are due to the different attributes of the air that makes them up. So you will remember from the lecture on cosmology, the substance monists had different views about what was the kind of primary element. In Diogenes' case, he thought it was air, and different attributes of the air, different types of the air, different kind of rarifications of the air accounted, in his view, for the differences between different animal kinds. The pre-Socratic writer who we have most biological material from is Empedocles. I spoke a little bit about his cosmological theories in a previous week, and that was his system in which love and strife are the primary forces which kind of ground and make up the universe. We have several fragments of Empedocles where he talks about the emergence of life, and he gives a sort of theory of what we might tentatively want to call natural selection. Here's a fragment that outlines that. So this is a fragment, I think, from Aristotle that explains his views. So Empedocles held that the first generations of animals and plants were not complete, but consisted of separate limbs not joined together. The second generation, arising from the joining of these limbs, were like creatures in dreams. The third was the generation of whole-natured forms, and the fourth arose no longer from the homogeneous substances, such as earth or water, but by interbreeding. The reason that this view is taken to be some kind of natural selection type theory is that it posits, like Epicurean physics, a sort of chaotic mixing of elements, and then beyond just elements, parts of bodies. And I think when he says limbs, he doesn't necessarily mean, there was just an arm floating around, there was a leg floating around. I think it's slightly more conceptual than that, but sort of the stuff of bodies. And then the combinations that work well tend to stick together, which is also what happens in atomic theory among the Epicureans. So something similar to the reasoning that random mutations that give an advantage then stick around and become the dominant type. But of course, it's very different in other ways. There's all sorts of reasons to be careful with that comparison with anything to do with evolution, because it's not an evolutionary theory as such. You may have noticed in the passage I quoted, Empedocles gives no account of how mutations are passed on through generations, and indeed he seems to be talking about a mix of sexual reproduction in the later generations, but at the start he seems to be talking about something more like kind of bacterial asexual reproduction. What stands out in both Empedocles and later in the Epicureans is that the system is random. In Aristotle, who also describes the combination of elements and how they make up bodies, there's always an idea of telos, an end goal, and I will come back to that shortly when I speak about Aristotle. In general, Empedocles' biological insights are driven by his four-element theory, which I talked about quite a lot in week 2, I think it was. So, for example, he explains creatures as having a preponderance of some elements, and that is what characterises their nature. So, fiery creatures, for example, aspire to reach the fire in the heavens, and you may remember from the outline of Aristotle's cosmology that the different elements had their kind of places in the universe, with fire at the outermost edge. That's an idea also found in a less worked out way in Empedocles. So his account is that fiery creatures, dragons, whatever, may be aspiring to reach the fire in the heavens. Watery creatures are aquatic, heavy, solid creatures whose nature is a preponderance of earth, remain on the earth. Airy creatures like birds fly. However, there do seem to be some oddities to this system. For example, Empedocles quite famously says that fish are fiery, and the reason that they live in the water is not because they have a kind of aquatic nature, but it's actually to cool themselves down. And it's not entirely clear why he said that. It's been argued that this is because Empedocles had a theory of respiration, and that's later found in the medical writer Philistion, who was a major influence on Galen. But this theory has been claimed to be in Empedocles, which is that the purpose of lungs is to draw in air to cool down a kind of inner fire. And if that's the case, it could be that Empedocles had made morphological observations about the similarities between the lungs of animals, the lungs of mammals, and the gills of fish, and that doctrine was based on that similarity. That's to say, fish are excessively fiery, so instead of flying up into the air, they cool themselves in the water. Who knows? Aside from these rather scanty pre-Socratic examples, we've not got a huge amount. From the classical period, the major biological writer was, of course, Aristotle, and I will be spending quite a lot of time on him in this lecture. But first, and briefly, I'm going to turn to a specific example, which is the example of embryology, which is a topic that pre-Socratic writers did write quite a bit about and were quite interested in, and which also comes up in the writings of Plato. Ancient embryology was an important science in and of itself, not as we now see it, as mostly part of gynecology and driven by concerns about maternal and fetal health. For the ancients, it provided part of the key to understanding life, and particularly to understanding how heritability worked. We see these issues primarily these days under the purview of genetics. Some ancient theories pertain only to human beings, but some also talk about animal reproduction. They can be broadly divided into two categories. There's the one-seed theories and the two-seed theories. So while female eggs were not understood or observed in antiquity, and indeed for quite a long time afterwards, two-seed theorists posited that, like male sperm, females contributed some sort of equivalent seed. And so two-seed theorists said that it was in the combination of the male and female seeds that the embryo was formed, and this could explain why you could see inherited characteristics from both the mother's and the father's side. By contrast, one-seed theories posited that only the male contributed a seed, and that the contribution from the mother's side was instead was the material stuff of the embryo rather than any kind of seed. One-seed theories were probably more popular, and the popular understanding of reproduction tends to put forward one-seed type explanations. There's a few examples in literature that kind of only really make sense as one-seed theories. We'll see in a minute Aristotle's theory, which was the most famous one-seed theory. However, most medical writers, and a few others including Pythagoras, Empedocles, Parmenides, favoured a two-seed theory. Plato, who didn't write a lot on biology, was also more of a two-seed theorist, and we do get a glimpse of his embryological theory in the Timaeus. Plato also there talks about not just about how many seeds there were, but also about the origin of seed. So many ancient theorists claimed that seed was created in the brain and circulated around the body, while Plato subscribes broadly to this theory. He thinks it's important to note that seed comes ultimately from the soul. And the reason that many of these thinkers wanted some idea of the seed coming from the whole body was to account exactly for this question of inherited characteristics and how that worked. Another debate in embryology was about whether the embryo was physically present within the seed or whether the parts of the embryo were formed after conception and the seed had some other kind of forming influence. So some who supported the first position argued that bits of the embryo were present in the seed, whereas some others argued in fact there was a whole tiny person in the seed and it just kind of grows afterwards. And you may have seen sometimes quite eccentric medieval diagrams of this. In general, the two-seed theorists tended to take a less worked out approach, and often in the case of someone like Galen, who argued for that the embryo was not present in the seed and that it developed afterwards. People like Galen favour an approach that says that the heritable characteristics and the material of the embryo come from a complex mix of sources, and that it's quite a messy process. As we'll see in a moment, somebody like Aristotle was much less happy with this more messy and complex type approach and tended to go for something where each thing had its defined role. Aristotle was one of the first thinkers to do large-scale categorization of biological principles. As I said earlier, while Empedocles had an elemental theory of biological properties, that's to say, some animals were fiery, some were watery, and so on, Aristotle expanded this hugely. To understand this in more detail, we should know two background things. First, Aristotle's theory of causation, and second, a little more about Aristotle's ontological classifications, that is, his theory of what is, particularly his theory of what count as primary and secondary substances and characteristics. Let's start with causation. I've talked in the first lecture and just now briefly about the idea of telos, the endpoint, and I talked quite a lot in the first lecture about teleological history, that is, history that leads up to an endpoint or a telos. Now, some of you will be quite familiar with Aristotle's theory of causation if you've done any ancient philosophy, but some of you may not be. So his theory of causation talks about 4 different types of causes, and telos is one of those. The 4 types of causes are as follows. So the first type is what's called, or what's usually translated as efficient causes. The second type, usually translated as material causes. The third type, usually translated as formal causes. And the final type, usually translated as final causes. And these 4 types of cause, which I'm going to explain what each of them is in a minute, became hugely important in and lasted kind of all the way through medieval philosophy. They were extremely influential. So the clearest way to explain what the different types of causes are is with an example, and I'll take the example of my desk, which I'm sitting at. So the efficient cause, that's the first type of cause, is used to denote the agent who created the object. So it's kind of like the who of the object. If you're trying to give a complete description of the object and how it came into being, it's the who made it. And in this case, it's the person who made the table, a carpenter, whatever, the person who actually physically hammered it together. So the efficient cause of a wall similarly might be a bricklayer, or the efficient cause of a dress might be a dressmaker. The second type of cause, the material cause, denotes, as you may have guessed, the material stuff the object's made of, i.e. the what of the object. So in the case of my desk, that's some wood for the desk top and some metal pipes for the legs. That's the most straightforward cause really to get your head around. Just what's it made of, what is it? I guess in English it's a bit weird to apply the term cause to the material stuff. The third type of cause is the formal cause, and that's best thought of as the kind of plan or template, the how of the object. How did it come into being? In the case of artefacts made by human beings, this is quite easy to grasp. In the case of this desk, whoever made it had in their head or on paper a plan of what they were going to make, so what the table would look like. A recipe for a dish is a perfect example of a formal cause. It's a plan of what to make and how to put the thing together. For living beings or for other natural objects, this obviously gets a bit more complex, and I will come back to what that might mean. The fourth type of cause, so this is telos, the final cause, is the one that's probably least natural to grasp as a type of cause, but it's the sort of thinking that we actually do all the time, and it's the why of an object, the object's purpose. So for artefacts made by human beings, again, this is usually quite easy to answer. What's the purpose of my desk? What's the telos of my desk? Well, it's to support things off the ground. Simple. What's the telos of the chair? It's for sitting on. What's the telos of a boat? It's for sailing. For living beings or for natural objects, this again gets a bit more complicated. What's the purpose of a human being? What's the purpose of a tree? So to get further with this, so we've got these four types of causation. They're going to be useful to bear in mind, and I will make reference to them. But to get further into thinking about how any of this actually applies to objects that aren't man-made, particularly to biological substances, I'm going to talk now a bit about the second point that I mentioned, which is Aristotle's ontological classifications. That is, what he thinks material substances are and which substances he thinks really do exist. So he talks about this in the categories, which is considered by many to be the central work of his organon, that is his logical works. I spoke about some of the more formalistic features of Aristotle's logic previously, but now I'm going to address some more of the kind of core ontological stuff. He also wrote about these issues in the Physics, where he talks a bit about what substances are. So for Aristotle, all physical things are a combination of matter and form, and you can see why material cause and formal cause are important types of causation in his thinking. This theory of everything being a combination of matter and form is referred to in the literature as hylomorphism, from hylos matter and morphos form. Organisms in Aristotle's thinking are paradigmatic substances, and that's a quotation. That's what a scholar of this, Marjorie Green, calls organisms in Aristotle's thinking. Organisms are the way they are, according to Aristotle, because of necessity in the Aristotelian system. And he distinguishes here between two different types of necessity. He talks about eternal celestial necessity, the necessity that the planets keep going round in the way they do, and necessity in the sublunary world. And you'll remember from the cosmology lecture that Aristotle did distinguish quite sharply between the stuff in the heavens, which is all made of ether, which is all perfect, and the stuff in the sublunary world, which is a bit more complicated, is made of the four elements. There's a lot more going on. And so in this passage from On the Parts of Animals, he's talking about different types of necessity, and he says there is absolute necessity, which belongs to the eternal things, the celestial sphere, and there's conditional necessity, which has to do with everything that's formed by the processes of nature. What does this mean? So Michael Boylan explains this using the Aristotelian analogy of a house. So logically and physically, if you're thinking about what a house is and the different causes of a house, logically and physically, the bricks and mortar of a house come first before the composite object house. If you're building a house, physically, in terms of constructing it, you have to put together the constituent pieces before it becomes the object. But in teleological and formal terms, in terms of what the purpose of the house is, and in terms of what your plan for the house is, the house as a whole object is prior to the constituent bits, the bricks and mortar. The bricks and mortar are really only serving the purpose of being the parts of the whole house. And you wouldn't, if you're thinking teleologically about a house, you think first about the house as a whole, and then about, okay, what's in this room? Okay, but what's this wall made of? How's this bit made? So on. So you've got these two different types of grounding, where if you're thinking in material terms, you think maybe about the parts of the whole first, but if you're thinking in teleological and formal terms, you're probably thinking about the whole and then about the parts. So I'm going to cautiously say the phrase causation runs backwards about this. I'm not talking about time, chains of material causes going backwards in time, merely that for Aristotle, the parts of an organism, of a biological organism, ultimately are there to serve a teleological end. So their manifestation in the whole organism and their working together for the proper functioning of the whole organism is in order to serve a teleological end. And so for Aristotle, he feels fine saying that the organism as a whole is conceptually prior. So therefore, although the purpose of eyes, for example, is seeing, and that only makes sense as an explanation taken in the context of the whole organism. The purpose of a dog's eyes is for the dog to see. And that, I think, is what Marjorie Green means when she talks about paradigmatic substances. The dog itself, as a whole organism, is a paradigmatic substance. And its eye is not, because its eye needs further context, the context of the dog, to be fully explained in formal and teleological terms. So for Aristotle, it therefore makes sense to classify organisms as kind of unitary paradigmatic substances, and then to delve into talking about their parts. Aristotle wrote a number of biological works that deal with these issues, and I'll go through them quickly and just explain what's in each of them so that you get an idea of the range of what he was discussing when he did biology. And then I'll focus on some specifics. So, number one, History of Animals, which is a kind of taxonomical work which tries to sort animals into groups. For example, it makes the distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates, animals that have a spine and animals that don't have a spine, which is obviously still a classification we use. Warm-blooded animals and cold-blooded animals, that sort of thing. And it kind of tries to create this kind of taxonomy where you can sort animals. Generation of animals, that discusses reproduction, embryology, birth, and the early development of various animals. It's quite a self-contained work. 3, movement of animals and progression of animals, which both discuss animal movement, especially the movement of terrestrial animals. Aristotle spends quite a lot of time in these works talking about different numbers of feet that different animals have and what that means about their movement. 4, parts of animals. This is anatomical and physiological, and Aristotle does a lot of detailed discussion of different organs and tissues and the comparative morphology of different animals. What does it look like if you compare a pig's liver with a cow's liver, for example? 5, on the soul. This is a highly important work that discusses the souls of different creatures within the taxonomies established in History of Animals, and it does talk about human souls, but it talks about other animals' souls as well. As with most of Aristotle's corpus, we don't know when these texts were written relative to one another. It's fair to assume that the History of Animals came before the History of Animals being the kind of taxonomical work, because throughout the corpus Aristotle uses quite consistent terminology. So, for example, he distinguishes between animals that give birth to young, live young, viviparous animals, and animals that lay eggs, oviparous animals, and those terms appear kind of throughout. Beyond that, some of the texts are on discrete subject matter, and so, like the text on embryology and generation, it's just a self-contained thing. So I'm not sure it matters too much with those texts whether we know the precise order. We do know that Aristotle did experiments and dissections to back up his work. These dissections were carried out in the Pyrrha lagoon in Lesbos, where Aristotle lived for a couple of years. And we think that was after Plato's death. Some scholars speculate that Aristotle expected to be Plato's successor at the academy, and then when he didn't, he wasn't made his successor. He had a falling out with Plato's nephew Speusippus, who became head of the school instead. This is quite a neat story, but we don't really have much evidence for it, and I'm a bit wary of this sort of biographical inference. Anyway, he spent this time in Lesbos. He did a lot of dissections. Many, but not all, of his dissections were on aquatic animals, and it's clear from his work that he's particularly interested in the physiology of fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and so on. One very famous investigation is his work on octopuses. He made some observations about these kind of chameleonic colour-changing properties in certain types of octopus, which were suspected for a long time to be that he just made them up. But in the 19th century, someone kind of redid some of these, and actually he was totally accurate on this. We think probably he must have known fishermen in the area, and he must have had quite a detailed knowledge of the marine life. He also observed octopus reproduction, and he argued that male octopuses have a special tentacle that stores sperm, which again was thought to be made up until the 19th century, and again was found to be actually accurate for certain kinds of octopus. A major feature of his biological taxonomy is that it considers several different interlocking organisational systems. So he's interested in physiology, but he's also then interested in thinking about how anatomy fits with other kinds of thinking about life processes, life cycles, homeostasis, breathing, those sorts of things. So in the first half of History of Animals, he considers physiological differences between animals, and in the second half he considers different types of animal life and activity, including character, habits, diet, health, and so on. So he's interested both in the bodies of animals and also the lives of animals and the way animals live and function. On the Soul puts forward another crucial taxonomy, which is that of the souls of different creatures. Aristotle defines the different souls in increasing order of sophistication as vegetative, that's the most basic type of soul, sensitive, that's the next one up, and rational. So these are sort of, I guess you might want to think of them as sort of parts of soul or kind of upgrade levels of soul. So they're stacked. So every living thing, he says, has a vegetative soul. Everything has the most basic type of soul. Animals have both a vegetative and a sensitive soul, and human beings alone have all three. In particular, there's a lot of interesting material about animals that Aristotle considers to be what's called dualizers, and these are animals that are between two categories in a way that seems somehow a bit wrong or misleading. So, for example, he talks quite a lot about whales, which are aquatic animals with respect to their living environment, but they're terrestrial animals with respect to their respiratory system. As we know, whales breathe air. And Aristotle's language of creatures as kind of a bit wrong or defective has had quite interesting implications for thinking about what constitutes the healthy and the diseased or disabled body in animals. And of course this was influential in medical thinking. But also about whether it makes sense for whole groups of animals to be considered as disabled with respect to their status as dualizers, but healthy as complete animals. And these sorts of ideas have had a lot of interesting input in recent years from disability theorists and so on. A lot of Aristotle's observations, since they take into account a huge range of animals, generate rules that almost always tend to be verified as true. And he comes up with these incredibly complicated rules, and you think he must really just have been paying a lot of attention to this huge amount of data he had. So, for example, he says no animal with horns also has tusks. Turns out to be true, as far as we know. or that he says viviparous quadrupeds, that is, four-legged animals who have live young, always have hair, while oviparous quadrupeds, any four-legged animal that has eggs, like lizards, for example, always have scales. And again, that turns out to be true as far as we know. So he really seems to have an interest, and I guess that comes from his general logical approach for generating these kinds of precise rules that you can only get if you're really comparing large quantities of collected data. On a more elemental scale, Aristotle's biological works are similar to the element theory of Empedocles, which I mentioned before. He believed that each type of living tissue had certain combinations of the primary elemental qualities, that is, hot and cold, wet and dry. And I've talked about how these feature in Aristotle's physics in previous weeks, but they feature very heavily in his biology too. So, for example, hair is, according to Aristotle, the coldest and driest tissue, whereas milk is the hottest and wettest tissue. Most human tissues are made up of blood in various combinations, and he explains this particularly with reference to fat. So blood is produced by the ingestion of food, he says, some of which gets excreted either in faeces, urine or bile, and some of which subsequently gets turned into bone, cartilage and teeth, but the rest stored as fat. For Aristotle, each organ or pair of organs in the body has a unique and specific function, the telos of a particular organ. So the telos of the lungs for Aristotle is breathing, the telos of the heart is blood circulation. And interestingly, this proved problems, this created problems in Aristotelian biology and anatomy for thinking about some kinds of organs. The appendix, famously in all of ancient and medieval anatomical theory, people wanted to find a purpose for the appendix, and the idea that you could have an organ that didn't have a purpose seemed to go completely counter to the Aristotelian theory of nature being basically parsimonious, that nature would basically create a body in which every organ had its part and they all function neatly together. And so the idea that you could just have this kind of pointless organ was really problematic for Aristotelian thinking. This sort of teleological reasoning works very well, in particular for embryology, which I mentioned earlier. And this is how Aristotle applies this to the formation of human beings through reproduction. So Aristotle's embryological theory, which is a one-seed theory, I mentioned earlier the one-seed and two-seed theories. His theory is probably the most famous one of antiquity, and it was certainly probably the most widespread. So his theory goes like this. He says, well, the father is the efficient cause of the child by means of his semen, which determines the sex and some of the characteristics of the child. The mother is the material cause because she provides the stuff that makes up the baby's body. And Aristotle thinks that that's by means of her menstrual blood, which forms the basic material of the fetus. Remember earlier that Aristotle says tissues and organs are made of blood, so you can see why he goes for menstrual blood as the material stuff that starts to make the embryo. The mother is also partly the efficient cause, and you can see that this is a bit untidy and Aristotle doesn't quite like it, but he has to have a way of saying why the mother determines some of the characteristics. I'll come back to that in a second. The formal cause is carried in the semen, so the father's also the formal cause. But in another sense, the mother and all other human beings are the formal cause. I mean, the child is made on the model of the genus human, and so talking about formal causes of humans can be a bit complicated. The final cause of human being, well, again, that's a very big question, and to explain what Aristotle might have answered that would take a whole extra lecture going into his ethics and so on, so we'll park that one. But so this is how the whole thing works, and I'll put a diagram up on the screen now. So to understand the chemistry here, you've got to take the point that Aristotle asserts without much further discussion that semen is hot and that menstrual blood is cold. I mean, evidently he'd never had a period. Anyway, he says The semen, which is hot, mixes with the menstrual blood that's cold, and the semen curdles the menstrual blood. The degree to which this process is successful codes for whether you're going to have a boy or a girl, depending on the temperature of the reaction. So if it's hotter, in Aristotle's language, if the semen overpowers the menstrual blood, you'll get a boy. If it's colder and the semen doesn't overpower the menstrual blood, you'll get a girl. There are also questions of degree. If the semen really doesn't overpower the menstrual blood much at all and it's pretty cold, you might get a female child who resembles her mother, whereas if it does a bit but not quite enough for a male child, you'll get a female child who resembles her father. So there's these kind of this is a way in which he also talks about resemblance and heritability, and particularly it's a way of accounting for how the mother's characteristics can be inherited in the child when the father is seen as the efficient and formal cause. And that works the other way around as well. Now, the misogyny in this system is really obvious when you read it. This terminology of overpowering, the feminine is essentially conceptualized in Aristotle, and this is kind of throughout his works as a deficient version of the masculine. But you can see how it makes sense if you're already within the chemical elemental system that Aristotle was, where everything has to be combinations of hot, cold, wet, dry, and the balancing of these different elements is what constitutes different characters and properties. Okay, I hope that's given you something of a picture of some bits of biology and zoology, and particularly some sense of how this all works in Aristotle. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about botany in the time that's remaining, and Theophrastus, who was a successor and close friend of Aristotle's, wrote the first extant work that's exclusively on plants that we have, and it's a very interesting work. So it's called Inquiry into Plants. It's a 10-book work written sometime in the late 4th or early 3rd centuries BC, and it has a companion work on the causes of plants, which deals with some of the same topics. So Theophrastus was from Erissus on Lesbos, so he was probably quite familiar with Pyrrha Lagoon, which I mentioned earlier, which was the site of Aristotle's dissections, and in fact he was probably a participant in some of Aristotle's zoological investigations. He also, because he knew Alexander the Great, was able to access botanical information from the eastern areas conquered by Alexander all the way, in fact, to India, which means that many of the plants that Theophrastus talks about aren't just narrowly those found in the Mediterranean, but actually found a long way into the Middle East or further into Pakistan and India. So he talks about plants like cotton, pepper, banyan, myrrh, cinnamon, all of which you wouldn't find in the Mediterranean. Theophrastus begins in an Aristotelian taxonomy of plant types, and that very much follows the model of Aristotle's history of animals. And he gives a thorough explanation then of the component parts of plants. He divides plants, again like Aristotle does, in several different ways, including into 4 categories: trees, shrubs, perennial herbs, and seasonal herbs. But he also follows other distinctions which are again similar to a kind of Aristotelian taxonomy. So for instance, he's interested in the distinction between wild plants and cultivated plants, aquatic plants and terrestrial plants. He actually talks quite a lot about aquatic plants, and so on. So the second book then of the Inquiry into Plants deals with plant reproduction, seeds, growth, and the mechanics of plant life. The later books then go into more detail on specific types of plants, and they're often speculated to be lecture notes rather than kind of fully worked out texts, because of their extremely elliptic style. For example, sometimes he just gives a list of types of trees with no further gloss. Interestingly, Theophrastus also gives a long discussion on the relative merits and characteristics of different types of wood, including a discussion of the effect of climate on trees. And so, with Aristotle, who wasn't just interested in animal physiology and anatomy, but also in the lives of animals. Theophrastus is interested in plants kind of in and of themselves, the physiology, that's not a word for plants, whatever it is, the equivalent is the structure and form of plants, but also the uses of plant and the roles of plants in the wider environment. So books 7 and 8 of the Inquiry on Plants deal with plants as food matter, and he discusses herbs, cereals and vegetables in some detail. The book 9 of the Inquiry on Plants is a discussion of herbal remedies, and as such it's kind of the first example of a herbal from antiquity that we have, a full one. Although later we get others, mostly in medical works, including in Galen, and I'll come back to Galen at some length in the next lecture. So let's look at some of Theophrastus's taxonomical concerns in talking about plants. Theophrastus, like Aristotle, was concerned with the question of what made a whole animal and what was a part of an animal and how this worked ontologically. And I explained that, for Aristotle, a whole animal was ontologically prior to a part of an animal. Theophrastus is quite bothered by what the notion of a part of a plant really means. He's aware that many plants, unlike animals, are by nature seasonal, and so they change from season to season in terms of their physical makeup in a way that's not quite the same as animals growing in childhood, for example. So, for example, do you count the fruit of a plant as part of the plant, given that it's actually what the plant kind of gives birth to if you're comparing it with animal reproduction? Theophrastus goes in the end for a quite inclusive and broad approach, and he includes flowers, fruits, leaves, and other parts of plants that may be seasonal. And he's probably a bit less concerned than Aristotle with the kind of hard ontological questions, but it's interesting that he does this. He then discusses the question of differences between different plants. So he talks about these various different options. He says, what about in you take two given plants, they might each have parts that the other does not, e.g. fruits or leaves. They might both have those plants, but they're very different in appearance or size, or they might both have those plants, but they're very differently arranged. So, for example, where the fruit grows on a plant, or whether the flowers surround the fruit or not. All of these variables make taxonomy of plants at times difficult. He makes a rough distinction of the subunits of plants, so he talks about roots, stems, branches and twigs, and he goes on to define those things quite precisely. So he says that like we analyse the different members of the human body as subunits of the whole, we can do the same with plants. In doing this, he's again a bit bothered. He admits that he can't identify a single unifying characteristic that all plants have, and as an aside, he makes the claim, which presumably is also what Aristotle thinks, that the unifying characteristic of all animals is that they have mouths and stomachs. As you'll have seen from this brief outline of ancient biology, zoology and botany, the two thinkers who shaped these disciplines most were Aristotle and Theophrastus. While their theoretical thinking about animals and plants fit, of course, into a wider tradition, the form of their work had an extremely long history throughout the rest of the ancient period and into the medieval and later worlds. Both Aristotle and Theophrastus took an approach which was interested in categorising, taxonomising, but also describing and cataloguing the enormous diversity of the biological world. Unlike the more ad hoc discussions of the pre-Socratics, both aimed to take a systematic approach to the living things that they encountered. Next week, I will talk about medicine, and there will, of course, be a fair deal of overlap between some of the topics discussed today and in the next lecture.